Okay,
Okay,
recording.
thank you very much. So, warm welcome to everybody joining this webinar. It's about medical device cybersecurity and especially the changing software regulatory environment in Europe for medical device manufacturers. It's a joint webinar between Jona Institute in Germany and Medcrypt in the United States. Let's start with a short introduction of us, Axel and me. My name is Christian Rosenzweig. I'm a medical device consultant at the Jona Institute since more than 7 years. I have a lot of experience in the medical device industry, especially in the regulatory field. And saying this, I will hand over to Axel.
Thank you, Christian. And yeah, this is one of many webinars we have done together, and I always find it enjoyable, always learn something. And again, appreciate your contribution to this webinar again as well. Yeah, my name is Axel Worth. I'm the Chief Security Strategist here at Medcrypt, a company focused on medical device specific security tools, services, and technologies. And we work with medical device manufacturers across the globe to help them to secure the devices and get them into the market. And as I said, we have had a long-standing relationship with the UN Institute and have collaborated on many projects before. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is going to be the agenda for today. I'm going to cover the first 3 topics, and then Christian is going to take over and close us out. And in the end, we have 10 minutes for questions. But as I said earlier, in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature that Zoom provides, and we will answer the question as they come in. Next slide, please. So the regulatory landscape, especially in Europe, is currently undergoing significant change, and there's more change coming. Certainly, medical device manufacturers face multiple overlapping regulations that affect their products and the software in their products. There is a whole series of critical deadlines approaching between 2024 deadlines that are already past us, but also deadlines that are coming in the rest of this year and next year. And certainly non-compliance with those evolving regulations can have serious consequences, can create market access barriers, can result even into penalties, legal liabilities, loss of market share, and so forth. So what we want to focus on today is to look at multiple European regulations, specifically MDR, IVDR, Cyber Resilience Act, and NIS2, and touch a little bit on the AI Act as well, as far as it relates to cybersecurity, and will help you understand how to navigate this complex landscape of overlapping regulations that are showing up in the European market. So we have and had for a while now MDR, the medical device regulation, where cybersecurity is specifically called out in Annex 1 and further interpreted in MDCG 2019-16, giving you specific guidance. And I think the most important point here is the concept of state-of-the-art security, right? The ability to comply with what regulators and standards organizations have put forward in terms of good security practices. Most commonly, it is that MDR regulated devices are exempt from CRA, but there are exceptions, and we will discuss those in a moment. That leads us then to the next bubble here in the diagram, that is the Cyber Resilience Act itself, that applies to all products with digital elements, which typically is non-regulated health devices, things like personal fitness trackers, baby monitors, and so forth, but also obviously other IoT type devices that we may be using in our personal lives. And the tricky part is that it may include accessories to MDR regulated medical devices. So components that are used in the environment of a medical device, but those components are not regulated under MDR. They're supplementary, but they may then be regulated under CRA. Then we have NIS2, which typically applies to operators and organizations that provide services and products in the 18 essential and important sectors across the European Union. And there are requirements in there with regards to cybersecurity, with regards to reporting of new vulnerabilities, cybersecurity incidents, monitoring of your supply chain, overall security risk management, and so forth. And it does, interesting enough, establish direct liability of your corporate leadership. So your company board, your executive management is actually directly liable under NIS2. And NIS2 may apply to medical device manufacturers should they, for example, provide hosting services in the European Union related to their medical devices, as, for example, host customer data, provide value-added cloud services, and so forth. And then lastly, and that's going to be only lightly touched on here towards the end, is the AI Act, which is a risk-based framework for regulating artificial intelligence, all of artificial intelligence, but there are also then certain safety obligations, applies to any AI-based product, including then specific cybersecurity requirements for AI-based products. So again, this is an overview what we will be talking about today. Moving to the next slide. So highlights, MDR and IVDR focus on safety and performance. And there is actually a significant revision that was proposed last December that is currently being discussed. And there is certainly some pushback on those revisions. We'll touch on details later. We have the Cyber Resilience Act that focuses on products with digital elements and focuses on cybersecurity. Is in force since December 2024, and various compliance deadlines are upon us in the course of this year, this calendar year, and next year. The NIS2 directive is about organizational security, right? Your infrastructure, including your customer-facing infrastructure. And the transposition deadline for NIS2 was in October 2024. And then lastly, the EU AI Act with AI-specific requirements, including requirements for cybersecurity, and it will be phased in the 2025 to 2027 timeframe across various milestones. That leads then to the next slide, highlighting some of the key milestones. So October 2024, NIS2 transposition deadline, December 2024 CRA enters into force. August of last year, the AI Act started to rear its head to limit the risk of AI-based tools and services. In December, the MDR IVDR revision was proposed, and then in front of us is now the CRA vulnerability reporting obligation in September. So any new vulnerability found in products with digital elements will need to be reported as spelled out specifically in CRA. And then in 2027, we then will establish the connection between the AI Act and MDR. And that is actually outlined in specifically a new publication from MDCG that came out in 2025, the -6 publication, which is an interpretation, additional guidance on what the AI Act expects. And then in December of 2027, all of CRA's obligations apply, including information about security incidents and so forth. Next slide, please. So what is in the MDR and IVDR proposed revision from last December? The goal was to provide simplification of the current rule for medical devices. Some people challenge whether that goal was actually met, and there is quite some pushback against some of the proposed modifications. Nevertheless, the established and defined goal was to make the rule easier, faster, and more effective, promote competitiveness and innovation in the market, and all while maintaining patient safety standards. And it addressed some of the past pain points the industry has voiced over the initial MDR regulation, including the slow approval process, the costly compliance burden, the unpredictable timelines of the go-to-market process, and unnecessary complexity. However, as I said, not all of the changes at this point were perceived as simplifications. And there is actually a Team NB white paper that specifically calls out some of the notified bodies concerned about the, again, proposed rule changes, which we don't discuss here in detail, but that white paper gives you, again, some of the concerns that were provided. For example, the Rule 11 under MDR was supposed to simplify and reduce the burden of Class 2 of medical device classification, including then the burden of devices that are classified as 2A and above, so 2B and 3 class devices with a higher regulatory overhead. And the Euro Institute has written a interpretation and discussion of that change, which really not in all cases actually lowered the burden, and several software-based products may now be classified under Class 2A and not under the lighter Class 1. And again, look at the blog for detail. And we also know that strict regulations can have impact on device market availability, on innovation. And RAPS has actually published a study on exactly that topic that actually shows that in the European market, there is significant pushback and market entry hurdles for medical device manufacturers. And many manufacturers are now concerned about keeping products in the market or introducing products to the market because of regulatory complexity, because of regulatory cost, timelines, and so forth. And again, not getting into details, please look at the RAPS paper. Specifically, what are the proposed changes? Certainly supporting digital regulatory procedures. So through digital processes, make the overall market approval process easier and better to predict. Harmonization across member states, simplified management of product modifications, reduced scope of AI regulations for certain medical devices, but then again, this is only MDR, so the AI Act is a separate topic. More provisions for rare disease devices to make them easier to introduce into the market. And then also, as many medical device manufacturers have experienced in the past, there are certification bottlenecks, right? You can't find notified bodies, or the notified bodies you can find have long timelines before they can actually deal with your market approval, and regulatory proposed changes would hopefully address those bottlenecks. Next slide, please. The classification, that is that Rule 11 we mentioned earlier, and that is supposed to simplify market approval for lower risk software devices. That I think has some benefit and demonstrable advantage, but I don't think it helped for all cases. And again, there's a blog post here to look at that. The provision of clinical evidence as as part of the approval process, and we expect some adjustment there. So hopefully that will result in further simplification and then reduction of regulatory overlap with the AI Act. So simplification on the MDR side, but in recognition of new regulation coming on board through the AI Act. So bear in mind, the process is still ongoing. So monitor the development so you know what will be coming and what changes will be coming, what advantages for you as a medical device manufacturer will come out of the changes, but also some of the complexities that may not go away. The proposal still must go through the European Parliament and the European Council, and the implementation timeline at this point is unknown. Next slide, please. And next click, please. One important point here is the reporting obligation. So once, for example, a new vulnerability has been detected in a MDR regulated device, or an incident has been reported in a fielded device, under the proposed changes, you need to evaluate whether that qualifies as a serious incident. If so, then you need to evaluate whether it is actively being exploited. Of course, if it was an incident, then you already have your answer. If it is a vulnerability, then you need to do your research. And then depending on whether that answer is yes or no, you need to follow different reporting models and different reporting paths. If it does not qualify as a serious incident, again, you need to ask the actively exploited question. And depending on the yes or no answer, there still may be reporting required via EUDAMED, or if it's not actively exploited and it is not a serious incident, then there is no reporting obligation. So it is I would say, moderately complex decision tree, but you need to make sure that A, your interpretation is correct, and B, that you document your decisions and document the evidence why you made that decisions, and then report accordingly, again, based on the three possible outcomes that require reporting, or document why you didn't have to report. And there's a link here to further explanation on what that reporting obligation looks like. Okay, now switching gears here to the Cyber Resilience Act. Next slide. So it was signed into law in October 2024, entered into force actually pretty quickly, December 2024. Vulnerability reporting, and that is in addition to the MDR vulnerability reporting, starts in September 2026, and then all obligations apply starting December 2027. And this is, notably the first European regulation that sets minimum standards for cybersecurity, including but not limited to reporting, for all products with digital elements on the EU market. Next, please. So who is affected? The manufacturers of those products, software developers, suppliers to an extent, importers, distributors, resellers. So anybody that places product into the market will now face CRA, cybersecurity requirements, and needs to perform conformity assessment to obtain CE mark, including, again, cybersecurity conformity in the European market. And this is similar to the framework for medical devices, but there are some differences. And yes, in general terms, medical devices regulated under MDR are exempt, but next, please. Non-medical software in healthcare may fall under CRA. So mixed products, for example, that have a medical device regulated component and a non-regulated component still may be regulated under CRA. Suppliers of components to medical device manufacturers may have to comply with CRA as those devices are brought to the European market, before they're becoming a medical device under MDR. There's also a clause in there about intra-group transfer of medical devices. So if you are a large international company, there may be certain activities of moving products within your organization before they hit the European market that may make them CRA compliant. Cloud-based services that support your medical devices, and even if those are business services or technical type services or not clinical, will require CRA compliance. And then, of course, there are reporting obligations for newly discovered vulnerabilities to your customers and to the public. So there is indeed an interaction between CRA and MDR. So the actual medical device, the physical box, may not be CRA regulated, but things in the periphery certainly could be and would be. Next, please. What are some of the key cybersecurity requirements? Security by design, vulnerability management through the entire product lifecycle. Software bill of materials is required for transparency. Software bill of material as the way you monitor your supply chain and giving you the ability to identify newly uncovered vulnerabilities in your supply chain components. Incident reporting under a very strict timeframe, 24-hour notification for actively exploited vulnerabilities. Then CE marking, including cybersecurity conformity, and your security update obligations once a product is placed into the market. Next, please. What is the consequence of non-compliance? You may be banned from the market, but you may be banned to sell anywhere in the EU if you run afoul with CRA. Potentially recalls of affected products, and then the resulting negative impact on your reputation. Loss of CE marking in the European markets, and then also legal consequences and fines up to 15 million euros or 2.5% of your global annual turnover. Next, please.
Yeah, that's my turn now. But there was one question that I want to answer quickly because it refers to Cyber Resilience Act. The question was, can you provide an example of non-medical software in healthcare under Cyber Resilience Act? Yeah, for example, if you have a medical system that needs information about the patient weight, and you have maybe a standard consumer patient scale that has maybe another software application to get the weight data from the scale and then hand it over to the medical device software. So the part of the scale and its application is under Cyber Resilience Act, and the software for processing the weight data, for example, for giving treatment suggestions or something like that, would fall under the medical device regulation. Okay, so now we talked about Cyber Resilience Act in the sense of a regulation that deals with cybersecurity of products. And now we go into another level. We talk about the network and infrastructure security, which is covered by the NIS2 directive. The NIS2 directive was created a few years ago, and it is valid in the whole European Union or the European market. But as it is a directive, it has to be translated first into national laws in the member states. And the transposition deadline was ending in October 2024. The purpose of this directive is to establish a unified legal framework for cybersecurity of organizations' infrastructure. So we are talking now about the network infrastructure, the software that you use in your company, the back-end services or cloud services that you make use of, and everything that is related to that. The target of the NIS2 directive are operators, manufacturers to to give pressure on the topic of cybersecurity. You might have realized that the company Stryker suffered from a terrible cyber attack yesterday. And this is a good example of why NIS absolutely makes sense, because the infrastructure of a medical device manufacturer, if it is compromised, has a dramatic impact on the outcome of the medical device company itself. So if they are not able to deliver products anymore, then you have a safety impact on the health business. And this is why we have to talk about regulations dealing with cybersecurity in the network or on the level of the organizational structure. When does NIS2 affect medical device manufacturers? So first, if you deliver products to the European Union and you belong to one of the critical sectors of the affected sectors, especially if you provide products considered critical in health emergencies, so situations like the pandemic situation where some ventilator machines were really important for the overall ecosystem of health, and that is especially considered here. There are some thresholds regarding the number of employees and the turnover, because small companies should be included from that NIS2 directive. Keep in mind, there is an Article 26 that says if an entity, as referred to in paragraph 1, is not established in the union but offers services within the union, it shall designate a representative in the union. So it's the same mechanism as with medical devices. If you are outside the European Union, you need a kind of representing company or organization that is liable for the regulatory requirements. And if you are not directly affected by NIS2, it could happen that there are obligations for suppliers that is applicable to your position or to your services. So the NIS2 is extended to suppliers, and that's according to Article 21, which says the supply chain security must be kept, including security-related aspects concerning the relationships between each entity and its direct suppliers or service providers. So be aware of not falling under the law directly, but it could happen that contracts between your customers and you enforce specific security controls. What are the core obligations of NIS2? For example, risk management measures. You have to identify risks and mitigate or minimize them accordingly. You have to do incident handling and reporting in a time frame that is given. You have to ensure business continuity. So you have to have a crisis management plan. The supply chain security must be provided. And all of that falls under the accountability of the management. So it's not the job or the task of an IT department, but it's a core accountability of the top management. So they should be aware of that responsibility and consider it, because penalties are very critical, up to 10 million euro or 2% of the global annual turnover, which can be a relevant high figure. If you want to implement those core obligations, you might find a good standard for that, the standard of information security or information security management systems, which is the ISO 27001. And if you implement that framework of ISO 27001, you have a good proportion of the NIS2 requirements already implemented, and there are just some additional legal or administrative obligations that come on top of the ISO 27001. But ISO 27001 is a very good base for implementing this too. And by the way, my suggestion is, if you are a middle-sized company or enterprise company, you should anyway implement ISO 27001, as we see with the Stryker example. Some cross-cutting topics. You might have an overlap of different regulations. So for example, The Cyber Resilience Act, the NIS2, and the MDR all address the supply chain security. And one very valuable and important tool for supply chain security is the so-called SBOM, Software Bill of Material, as a central compliance tool. That means that you list all your components in your system, especially the third-party components, but not only them, but also your own components in the system. And with this comprehensive list of all components in a hierarchical dependency, you have a good starting point for supplier requirements, because then you know which suppliers are in the game, are used. Especially the open source software is under control because you know which one is incorporated in your system. And that allows a continuous monitoring of dependencies and especially of vulnerabilities, because the SBOM is the base element that you need for vulnerability monitoring. Of course, all those regulations might have interplays which results in a complex situation maybe. So MDR is about safety and performance regarding medical devices. CRA is about product security for all products with digital elements, excepting the medical devices. NIS2 is an organizational security regulation, and AI Act deals with AI systems specifically. But now it can happen that you have a system that consists of medical devices and non-medical devices that incorporates functionality of AI, so it has machine learning models in it, and at the same time, you as a company fall also under the NIS2. That means that you have to implement all four regulations at the same time. And there might be situations where you get completely lost in that overall framework because it's a huge matrix that you have to cover here. Some practical challenges, especially coming from that overlap, are that you have overlapping requirements. Sometimes the requirements are conflicting, sometimes they are complementary, and you have to be aware of that and have to deal with that. Sometimes you have resource constraints, particularly if you are small and medium business companies, because, for example, if you need an AI expert, if you need a NIS2 infrastructure expert or cyber resilience experts, you do not have the capacity. Either you do not have enough personal resources, or they do not have the necessary qualification. So you have to invest in team building and qualification first. The notified body capacity might also be a problem. Notified bodies not only for the medical device, but also for the Cyber Resilience Act or for the AI Act, which also need notified bodies under certain conditions. And the question is, do they have enough expertise, and are there enough notified bodies? And that can be a bottleneck in your overall regulatory strategy. And also mind the documentation burden. Multiple frameworks might mean multiple formats of documents, of documentation, and that is, again, additional work that needs resources. So the pain points might be different reporting timelines across regulations, varying documentation standards, limited guidance on harmonized standards or harmonized approaches. So, for example, the Cyber Resilience Act up to now has no harmonized standards. So you have to find out what is the state of the art on your own. And sometimes there's a shortage of qualified assessors that help you or support the process of implementing those regulations. I tried to describe that in detail. So as an example, for example, if you have a system with medical devices and at the same time there are non-medical devices in the same system, then for the medical devices, you have to follow the harmonized standards or state of the art. For example, for cybersecurity, the IEC 81001-5-1 or the US standard AMI SW96 for security risk management. And then you do, in the end, your conformity assessment and place a CE mark in the declaration of conformity under MDR. And at the same time, for the parts of the system that fall not under MDR, you have to cover the Cyber Resilience Act, which means you have to find out what are the harmonized standards or what is the state of the art for that. And that could be a different one, for example, IEC 62443-4-1 for the life cycle of security, or the 62443 -3-2 for the security risk management. And that's not necessarily the same as for the medical devices. So you have a parallel process framework. And for the Cyber Resilience Act, also a conformity assessment that is needed, and also a CE mark and a declaration of conformity, but this time under the Cyber Resilience Act. So you have to do everything in parallel, horizontally. That means you have to think about how do you implement that. Do you really want different distinguished processes, for example, for cybersecurity lifecycle and cybersecurity risk management? Or can you find a common sense, a common framework or common process landscape that covers all the regulations in this at the same time? When does a medical device fall under the AI Act? That's also an interesting question. There are two conditions. One is the device falls under a class or falls into a class for which a notified body is necessary. So, for example, class 1 with measurement function, or class 1, which is a sterile product, or the higher classes 2A up to 3. If you need a notified body based on that, then this criteria is fulfilled. And the other criteria is the AI either is the product itself or it serves as a safety component of the device. Now, what is a safety component? A safety component is a component of a product for an or of an AI system which fulfills a safety function for that product or AI system, or the failure or malfunctioning of which endangers the health and safety of persons or property. And that's the case for many medical devices. So in many medical devices, the AI component is a safety component, and so both criteria might be fulfilled. And then the AI Act is applicable on top of the medical device regulation. And I tried to go a little bit deeper at that stage to show you what implications are coming from the statement that you have to apply the medical device regulation and the AI Act at the same time. So for the medical device regulation, you have your general life cycle, your design control life cycle with an accompanying safety risk management according to ISO 14971. So this is the given environment of medical devices. Now, if you incorporate software into your device, then also the cybersecurity lifecycle applies, which means that you have to do also security risk management with a different protection goal, because for the security risk management, the protection goal is more security goals, CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Safety risk management is focusing on preventing health damage. But in the end, there's a connection between both risk management processes that says if a security risk might have also an impact on the health, then it should also be handled or managed in the safety risk management process. So there's an interaction between both. And now a new dimension comes into the picture, which is AI. And the AI Act requires also an AI or machine learning lifecycle, and in parallel, AI risk management. So this AI risk management asks, for example, what can go wrong with the AI model? What would have an impact on the functionality and on the outcome of that AI model? This is the typical question in that AI risk management. But here is again another connection, because security risk management can also have impacts on the AI. For example, if an attacker modifies the AI model, then you have an AI risk. Or if data that is used for creating the model, to train the model, is compromised from an attack or by an attack, this is a security risk, but it has in the end also an AI impact. And this AI impact is not the only thing that you should consider, because an AI risk can again have an impact on safety. So there are multiple interconnections between those pillars here, and you have to keep that in mind and have to cover that by your overall processes and by your overall documentation. And the notified bodies, as well as the FDA, want to see the interaction of all those considerations. I try to go deeper in that, but maybe it's too confusing here. I just try to enter some regulations or guidances or standards to cover the corresponding activities. So you see, in the end, it's a huge framework that you should apply, and it's up to you to integrate this framework into your overall process landscape. Here's another document that I want to point out, the MDCG 2025-6. Axel already mentioned it. It's the interplay between the Medical Device Regulation and the Artificial Intelligence Act. So this is relevant if you have AI in your products, and it gives you some advice how to create this overall picture here. Yeah, in the end, I want to make some actionable recommendations. So here are some immediate actions that you should take, because if you look at what we showed to you now, it might be overwhelming. So you must focus on the most critical or the most prioritized topics. So for example, a gap analysis would help dramatically. Your immediate action should be a gap analysis that maps current compliance status against all 4 regulations. So you should find out what are the gaps to the 4 regulations as far as they are applicable to you. Without waiting for the result of the gap analysis, you can immediately start with the SBOM implementation, because you will find out this is necessary for all regulations. So SBOM implementation means you must find a way to create SBOMs, to manage them in the sense of configuration management. You might have in the end multiple SBOMs in multiple versions. And then you should use the SBOM for vulnerability monitoring, for supply chain management. So this is the starting point for you. If you have SBOMs implemented, you can immediately go on with the vulnerability management, because vulnerability management means you have to establish a process to consume information about vulnerabilities based on the SBOM, for example, including a coordinated vulnerability disclosure process. So how do you communicate known vulnerabilities to stakeholders like the operators, the authorities, or other stakeholders like information sharing and analysis organizations. And also the update and patch process is followed by the vulnerability management process or included there. So this is also a process that you need anyway. So you can immediately start with that. When I do consulting projects, I often realize it's not the problem of the technology or the amount of actions that you have to perform. It's more the qualification and the team resource aspect. So building up teams and providing adequate qualification is a core principle of cybersecurity. So that's also an action that you should immediately start, to ask your management for resources, to build the teams and to train them. Because if there is nobody who deals with security, then the processes are lost in space, because nobody is responsible for them. Or at least, even if they are responsible, they do not know how to implement them. So the qualification is also crucial. Yeah, here are some statements about the software bill of material. So it's a complete end-to-end software inventory list for the devices you created at build level. So it extracts from the code all dependencies and lists all components. And for the infrastructure, you can do that based on the current runtime. All software is now a manufacturer liability, all components and dependencies. So you are responsible if you implement something into your product, a third-party component, then you are responsible for this third-party component. And this refers to commercial, embedded, open source component as well as your own components. The Cyber Resilience Act says security updates should be guaranteed for at least 5 years from the time when the product is placed on the market. But that is, of course, just a minimum requirement. Usually you should provide updates for the lifetime of the product. Yeah, and then you should have a process to select, approve, integrate, manage, and maintain all software components, which means if you identify that a supplier is not good enough because of too many vulnerabilities or because of too slow processing of vulnerabilities and too slow patching and updating process, then you should get rid of that supplier and should replace it. And this is a process that belongs to the supplier management. Continuous vulnerability monitoring is based on the SBOM and supporting risk assessment and management. So you provide security updates. That's the update and patch process. Yeah, and that's exactly your job now. Some words about the strategic planning. You should implement a long-term compliance strategy, integrate compliance into the product development, so a security by design concept from day one of your product development. Build compliance checkpoints into the secure development lifecycle. Establish cross-functional regulatory monitoring teams, which consist of legal roles, engineering roles, quality, and cybersecurity roles. So it's a team sport. It's a interaction between different roles. And what is also important to monitor MDR revisions and also AI Act revisions, which we talked about before. So this is the starting point for your preparation today. So with that, we are finished now, right in time, so we can get to the Q&A section, and I see we already have more than 9 questions in the list.
Yeah,
Axel, have
so
you already prioritized?
yeah, let's just go down top down the list. I answered some questions online, but I think the remaining ones, excuse my voice, are worthwhile discussing. For example, the first one basically asking about the difference between medical devices used for clinical studies as compared to actual medical device products that are being marketed. How does that impact cybersecurity regulations in Europe?
Yeah. Shall I answer?
Yes, please.
Yeah, that is an important question. Of course, clinical studies are a limited market entry point, so it's not as critical as if you place the product on the market in a commercial way. But on the other hand, if you place devices next to the patient or if you apply the medical devices on a patient, for example, during a clinical study, they must be as secure and as safe as possible. So they must fulfill already the general safety and performance requirements. And this is exactly verified by the ethical committees. So they require documentation to be able to challenge the safety and performance of the device. So you must already give some evidence that they fulfill security and safety. Not to the extent that you need for the commercial release when you do your official conformity assessment, but at least you must demonstrate that those devices are secure and safe enough for the intended clinical study.
Great. Thanks, Christian. Next question, how do you suggest the regulatory strategy for cybersecurity, the focus of this webinar, be tied to overall regulatory strategy for the device? So I think the short answer is traditionally, both in the European Union as well as here in the US, cybersecurity regulation was tied to safety and effectiveness. But if any cyber compromise of a device could lead to patient harm, then that certainly was a tie back to overall device safety considerations. What we see increasingly, certainly here in the US, but also in Europe, that cybersecurity is now considered an important factor just by itself, right? It is about, for example, disruption of care. So even if a cyber attack on a device or cyber compromise of a device does not directly harm a patient, it could impact care delivery. And we know from several studies now that delay in care delivery can lead to patient harm, increase in mortality rate. And one study out of the UK even showing a death of a patient because of a delayed diagnosis. So clearly there is, again, a connection between cybersecurity and safety, but also cybersecurity as a whole, because a compromised device can compromise care delivery and hospital operations. Christian, anything you want to add to that?
No, what we usually do is we do a standard regulatory workshop and try to find out what are the particular regulatory standards or regulatory requirements to be fulfilled for the target markets. So first we make an overall investigation or evaluation on that. And sometimes you find out that you have very particular regulations. For example, in Germany, the hospitals have a law that asks them for implementing this so-called C5 catalog for cloud infrastructure. C5 is a kind of requirement that is based on 27001 plus additional requirements for the cloud service. And this is not necessarily covered by the manufacturers because they needed a kind of certification for that. And if they do not provide that, they can't sell their product to the hospitals. And if you miss such a requirement in your very early strategy, that could have impacts on your overall business strategy. And that is why we strongly recommend to do a careful investigation during the regulatory strategy.
Okay, thank you. So we got 5 minutes left. I don't think we're going to get through all questions, but we captured them so we can follow up by email. So there was one question, I just want to briefly address it, and that is, do contracts override prior law when it comes to exposing supplier information? And then the question gives a couple of examples. So I am not sure about the answer here, to be honest. I just want to, again, acknowledge the question as such. I would advise to see legal counsel on that, in a sense on whether there is a possible legal conflict between disclosure requirements, such as through an SBOM, as compared to contractual protection of supplier information. So again, a little bit out of my wheelhouse, and advise again to seek legal counsel. Christian, anything?
I fully agree.
Same to that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Pick a next question here. Does security risk management integrate part of the implementation of ISO 14971?
That's a good question. Yeah. Shall I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, if you look into the MDCG guidance 2019-16, you will see that it says you should make use of the 14971 framework for security risk management, but that does not necessarily mean that you implement the security risks into your existing safety risk table. In fact, if you look at the very last page of MDCG 2019-16, it shows exactly the same diagram as which you find in the AMI TIR 57, which says you have to implement the safety risk management according to the framework 4971, and in parallel, a complete parallel process for the same framework, but content-wise with the security risks. So you have in the end two parallel risk management files, a security risk management file with security management plan, security risk table, and security management report, and the same for the safety. And in the end, you have to make sure that you consider the interactions between both. So security risks might have been an impact on safety, then you have to transfer the security risks into the safety world, and vice versa. Security controls might also have an impact on safety risks, and safety risk controls might have an impact on security risks, and this interaction must be demonstrated in your overall documentation.
Great, thank you. One question here that came in early, but just to recap, and Christian, you discussed some of that. But basically the question is if NIS2 applies to the IT infrastructure of the medical device manufacturer, similar to Critis, for example, in Germany, and then MDR applies to the marketed medical device with network connection themselves, but not NIS2. My short answer, and Christian, I'm sure you have something to say about that too, is that that is correct. The device itself is not covered by NIS2 from the manufacturer perspective, but the hospital operator may be covered under NIS2. So clearly, whatever security features you design into the device and security processes you follow as a manufacturer needs to enable your customers, the operators of the devices, to meet their requirements, be it under Critis, be it under NIS2, or if you operate here in the US under HIPAA.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Just one additional comment. If you look carefully into the ISO 27001, which I said is the base for implementing the NIS2, then you will see that ISO 20001 requires a process for security if you develop products. So the security by design principle for products is also somehow integrated into the NIS2. That is somehow an interaction between both worlds, the product world and the infrastructure world.
Okay. And since we're coming to the end of time, I'll pick one more question that was posted anonymously. The other ones, we have the names, so we'll try to get back to you. Oh, there's a follow-up question to what we just talked about. Sorry, change of direction. And the question is, but having separate tables for safety and security risks is difficult to maintain. Can we have one risk management document encompassing these two listed together since they feed into each other at some point? So I personally
don't recommend.
Yeah, I was going in the same direction. I would disagree, especially now that cybersecurity from a risk management perspective is looked at as a separate activity, and even cybersecurity risks that are not safety risks need to be treated. So if you put that into one big table, you have, I think, process and management challenges, but also how do you then handle the difference in your, for example, risk assessment criteria, especially as you may assess impact of an event, right, which is very different in a safety risk table than it would be in a security risk table.
Exactly. And the dependencies are also difficult to show between security targets and safety targets.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully it was helpful. Can you move to the last slide, Christian? Here's our contact information. If you want to reach out to us, and then there are additional resources you can consult. And as we said initially, we will distribute the slides. We will provide the recording link. and the open questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A, we will address offline by email. And again, thanks everybody for joining, and thanks Christian for being again a good co-presenter here.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Okay, have a good day. Bye.